Hey, what's up guys? I'm Josh, and unfortunately I have to start this off with an apology. I had done a community poll on whether or not you guys wanted to see a review with one of these units or two of these units, and you guys overwhelmingly voted for two. Unfortunately, when I went to go pick up a second unit, they're all sold out around me, and it was going to be like weeks to get a second unit. So I took the community post down. If you did vote on that, I apologize. But this is going to be just the review of the single unit HomePod. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Okay, so I think that a lot of people are sort of expecting me to sort of shit on this device, especially because it's titled Review for Audiophiles, or an audiophile review. And I am going to get there, but first, I do want to give this thing a couple compliments. One is going to be the general design. The general design is, in terms of aesthetics, fairly nice. It's got this sort of weaved kind of fabric overlay. It's fairly dense and it feels solid. It feels like it's actually worth the money that you paid for it. In between the midnight and the white options, I think that this will fit in with most different design aesthetics for different houses and places that it might be placed inside of. It's got sort of an Apple-y feel, but it's not too far down the rabbit hole that it's going to stick out amongst a bunch of non-Apple stuff. That being said, there are some complaints that I do have about the device itself. One is there are no analog inputs. This is a speaker that on the website is claiming to be a high fidelity speaker with nothing but AirPlay for it, which is unfortunate. Now, when it comes to the spatial audio, this is one of the more disappointing aspects of this. This actually led me to sort of believe, probably falsely, and there's probably a lot of you who are not under this belief, but I kind of thought, okay, they're gonna try to do something with stereo here because that would make sense for spatial audio, right? You'd have like things coming from over here and over there. And that's kind of the vibe that I, like the interpretation that I got from them including spatial audio in not only the product page, but their presentation for it. It's not like that. This is a mono speaker through and through. It sounds like a mono speaker. It does not sound like there are things coming from different places in the environment like I was expecting with spatial audio. I'm not even sure what spatial audio is actually doing in this speaker at all. Another thing I will add here is there is, when playing over AirPlay, and this may be specific to my network, but I have a pretty good network, so I'm not confident that's the issue, but there is a pretty sizable playback delay when you play, pause, or switch songs. It takes a notable amount of time. Okay, now I want to talk about some of the features of this device. There are a couple cool ones that I think are pretty neat. One, this can do sort of an intercom system. So if you have several HomePods throughout your home, you can actually say, "Hey Siri, intercom," and it will display what you're going to say to all of the HomePods in the house. That's a pretty cool feature. This also has something called spatial audio and sort of this room adjustment mode where you kind of just play it, and it has microphones that listen to the environment and try to DSP correct and apply different kind of sound characteristics to the different speakers to produce a cleaner signal. And I actually think that this particular portion works pretty well. I've noticed that a lot of these home speakers do have a tendency to sound very echoey almost. They sound not so clean as a signal, but this actually does a fairly good job of sounding pretty clean and not involving a lot of the room environment, which I like a lot. They did add a removable power cable over the previous generation. A lot of people were appreciating that. There are a bunch of third-party like mounting hardware options for different wall mounts. There are even like tall speaker mounts that you can put this on for this device. So you do have a lot of different mounting options for your home if you do choose to get this. Another feature here is the tap to play. You can kind of play a song on your phone and then just kind of hover it over and it will transfer that song to this device. And it works most of the time, but not all. It's not particularly reliable. A quick note on utility here. Because this has sort of an upward firing woofer, and speaking of that design, the woofer is actually located on the top facing upward, and the series of speakers around it are actually located on the bottom. Now, because that woofer is firing upwards, it has a slight tendency to vibrate on anything that isn't a very, very solid piece of furniture. So if you have a relatively thin desk or like something that's hollow, you're probably going to hear a lot of vibration, not from this, but from the actual furniture that it's on, especially when you get higher in volume or listen to bassy music. Things like countertops or really solid desks, generally just any solid piece of furniture is going to be okay with this device and not rattle too much, but it was something that I noticed when testing on different places in the room on different pieces of furniture. Now, as far as a audiophile review of this device, is that fair? In some cases, no. Like, I think that this is Apple overstepping their bounds in terms of what they are calling this device. They're calling it a high fidelity speaker, literally using the word high fidelity. So in my opinion, that makes it fair to assess as a high fidelity speaker, even though it's going to perform poorly. But in reality, I think my personal opinion on this matter is that it's kind of just Apple being overzealous with their terminology. And while it's fun to kind of poke and laugh, I don't actually consider this a real consideration for a high fidelity speaker, and I don't think you should either. Once again, I want to start off with some compliments here. In terms of the volume output potential of this and the bass output potential of this being a relatively small device, it's actually pretty good. It does do a good job of actually legitimately filling a room with sound, and it can sound quite loud in a small environment. I would have no problem recommending this for kind of home garages, something like that, maybe like an industrial space like this one. Also, in terms of living rooms and kitchens, I think this is going to do just fine as well. It might actually be a little bit overwhelming for really small like bedrooms, and you're probably always going to be turning it down rather than turning it up. So in terms of volume output, it's actually doing a decent job. Now, to bring up that spatial audio again, the simple fact that this can't do stereo eliminates this as a consideration for a high fidelity speaker, in my opinion. But as far as a single speaker, it's not a high fidelity speaker, and you can tell that when breaking down some of the characteristics of the sound quality. The general bass sound does come out of the speaker, and in some songs and with proper placement, it actually sounds relatively thumpy to an untrained ear. When you're coming at it from an audiophile perspective, you're really going to be noticing that different frequencies tend to dip and increase depending on the placement of this, just like just about any speaker. But some speakers have a better tendency to be able to kind of have a more consistent roll-off with a myriad of different placements, whereas this one really has a different type of bass response depending on where you place it. And I really couldn't get this to sound very complete throughout the bass response. Either it was boomy and bloated in the mid bass, or it had almost no sub bass and all mid bass, but it sounded clean in the mid bass, or it had almost no mid bass and a little bit of sub bass. It was kind of all over the place. I couldn't get a consistent read on it. But to use more audiophile terms, I would consider the bass to be elusive and kind of relatively wavy. It wasn't particularly solid all the way through. When it comes to mid-range, this is a little bit of a mess in my opinion. Dynamics are really good here, but when it comes to kind of the lower mids, they're a little bit dipped down. The upper mids, especially for females, are a little bit shouty. And on higher volumes, this can come across quite harsh. Placement for the mid-range actually didn't seem to matter as much, and I will praise them for their DSP capability, making it so that that mid-range sounded very clear, no matter how loud it was. Even in a small room, it didn't have that kind of echoey kind of reverb that you would get from a lot of other speakers. But that being said, in terms of frequency response and tuning, the timbre capability was pretty decent for what I would expect from this, but in terms of frequency response, it really wasn't able to keep up with what I would consider to be kind of a decent mid-range experience. When it comes to treble, treble extension over 10K is not really present here. It's not a very treble forward speaker, and I think for its intended use case, that's a good thing. But in terms of like, again, that more analytical approach to analyzing this, this really does sound incomplete compared to even very, very cheap speakers. This also is a little bit less flexible for timbre than the mid-range is. The timbre kind of tends to blend together for a lot of different instruments. So if you go listen to a lot of rock music, for some reason, most of the cymbals sound the same, even though if you listen on a more vibrant and colorful and timbre correct system, the cymbal differences can really, really be noticeable. In a weird way, it would kind of combine all the different types of cymbal sounds into what I would consider like just like a default cymbal sound. It was just not super flexible on the top end. And you'd really notice that in different acoustic instruments like cymbals, but you'd also notice it in some string instruments as well. So in terms of recommendations, if you're looking for an audiophile experience or a high fidelity experience, I wouldn't recommend this. A really cheap and good system would be something like a pair of Mica RB42s, which are under 150 bucks, and a versatile like Bluetooth and digital input capable amplifier like a SMSL AD18. Not the best amplifier in the world, but that system is actually going to come in slightly cheaper than this by just a couple bucks. But it's going to sound a whole lot better, and you're going to involve stereo imaging and really deep sound staging, which you are not going to get from this, decent treble extension, and fairly good bass as well. And you get to play around with just having an actual kind of low-end hi-fi system, which in my opinion is a lot more fun than this. Now, in terms of my conclusion, for average users, I think that the speaker is actually pretty great. I think that most people who are not audiophiles are not really going to be caring about the sound of this. I'm sure if I played it for my parents, they'd really like the sound that was coming out of this device, and I wouldn't blame them for it. And considering the size of the package that sound is coming out of, it actually is pretty impressive as kind of this little speaker. The room filling capability here is probably its most impressive component. It really makes the speaker seem present in the room, and it really does seem like the environment is more alive than most other kind of home speakers like this would be. Now, that being said, is this for audiophiles? Of course not. I think everybody knew that. I think a lot of people just wanted me to say it. And yeah, I don't believe this is going to be a satisfying speaker for just about any seasoned audiophile out there. Thanks so much for watching. Until the next video, I'll see you guys next time.